Hello, everybody who is watching, and hello, everybody who isn't watching as well, just to be all-inclusive. I'm John Atack, and yet again, I welcome my friend and colleague, Joe Szimhart. Hi, Joe.
Hello, John. Thanks for having me on again. And what are we talking about today?
Well, first of all, I'd like to congratulate you on presenting your pet rock the last time we spoke as a demonstration of complete stillness in the universe, except when you move it around, of course, but you've just invented a term, so I think we ought to broadcast it as far as we can, which is cult leader syndrome. And I think you should trademark it personally, but
I'll give it a go, but this is the first public demonstration, so
well, we send this to the Copyright Office and make sure,
Yeah, so John, we're entering into virgin territory here. Are you ready? So I'll explain, like I explained before, what happened. I was writing I wrote a review about Andrew Cohen's new book about being a bodhisattva that came out this year. Andrew Cohen famously ran an organization called FACE, Friends of Andrew Cohen Everywhere. And that was the name of his cult, FACE. And he also had a thing called Enlighten Next. It was one word. And he believed in something called evolutionary enlightenment, that we're all evolving toward enlightenment, sort of in some kind of a magical spiritual way. And that he's one of the key figures that's pushing the human race toward that evolution. That's how he built himself. And he's coming out now after being disgraced by the cult collapsing under him and then they kicked him out. And 4 or 5 books, including one by his mother called The Mother of God, was written to expose his shenanigans as a brat.
I just want to pause on that title. What a great name for a book. The Mother of God. His own mother was involved with him and left and wrote a book.
She was involved for like 8 years and broke away. And he wanted her to see him as God or as Atma or whatever, the non-dual presence. And right. And considering that they were Jewish, it even has a double entendre, Mother of God.
Exactly, yeah.
So Luna Tarlow, I had lunch with her, wonderful lady. She was a poet. And after she wrote the book, I interviewed her in New York and we had a good lunch. But all that aside, so I wrote this review and the editors at International Cultic Studies Association for the magazine felt that I had overdone it and got into too much territory and that it was more like an article. And so somehow I blurted out that, what I'm really writing about it, this guy has cult leader syndrome. And they kind of tweaked their interest and they said, well, why don't you write about that? And I said, okay. So I started looking it up. And of course, there is no such thing as cult leader syndrome in terms of any kind of legitimate literature. And I don't know if I'm ever the first person that said it because it didn't come up anywhere. So I started looking into it, and of course, a syndrome is an illness, and it's a form of illness. And so this is what a syndrome is. It's a set of medical signs and symptoms which are correlated with each other and often associated with a particular disease or disorder. The word derives from the Greek blah, 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 meaning concurrence. When a syndrome is paired with definite cause, this becomes a disease. So something has to cause it, something. So with the guru syndrome, what's causing it is self-identification as a guru when there's really a lot of evidence to show that they're not very good teachers. So they still believe in it. So it's kind of a delusion, which now we're getting into psychological medical territory, so if it continues and it even after they've been disgraced and like this Andrew Cohen is reinventing himself, like so many others have, Ron Hubbard, for instance, kept reinventing himself. The founder of EST, Werner Erhard, went and taught the same thing in Europe after being disgraced in the US. The list goes on and on. And so you have this problem of, is this a syndrome? Is this an illness now? They can't stop doing it, kind of like someone with a fixed delusion. So I started exploring this, and the only thing I could come up with, which was close, was called imposter syndrome, which is in the literature, which is a thing, you know, and that is something that came around in 1968 and was coined much later, a couple decades later, as a real thing, in regards to articles about women who had achieved, you know, in the 80s and 90s, high corporate levels of accomplishment, and yet felt they didn't belong there, felt they were imposters, even though their peers thought they were brilliant, you know. So they had what was coined as imposter syndrome, and because they almost needed therapy to overcome this anxiety, you know, and of a feeling like a fake when they weren't. Now, if you flip that over, because you and I were talking about this, you know, most of the cult leaders that we criticize in our world, to some degree or another, are fakes.
Yeah.
You know, in other words, they don't live up to the reality they claim to represent. So in other words, they're faking. And you know, is that a syndrome? Okay, I'm going to throw in one more thing here because this is important. As you know, in our community, we are often criticized by the social science community, the sociologists of religion especially, that want to see these deviant, what we call deviant groups, as just alternative religious movements or new religious movements, or, you know, something like that, or maybe softly a sect. But they don't like the word cult. They don't like that derogatory whatever it is behind it. So to address that in this paper, I had to address this problem of medicalizing social behavior, which these sociologists hate. And you know, they've written, I mean, there's whole papers done on medicalizing deviance, which cults fall under that as deviant religious groups. And the psychological community and the anti-cult community has medicalized it by saying, well, it's delusional, it's psychotic, it's you know, it has narcissistic traits. And these are all medical terms within the psychological field, right? And sociologists tend, in that clique of sociologists, tend not to like that. Like, by that clique, I mean Anson Shoup and Lewis and Melton, and you know the names. There's about 10 of them that keep
Jeffrey
coming up.
Haddon and one or two.
Haddon and Cessnor, you know, the group Cessnor.
Yes, I do.
You know, so they're the ones that would argue that we should not medicalize deviance. You know, so okay, so there, I'll leave it at that, because I'm in the middle of this thinking, and I'm not sure where I'm going to go with it, but I am going to face it. FACE, Friends of Andrew Cohen Everywhere. We're going to face that and see if it's, you know, leading to him becoming a guru with cult leader syndrome. All right.
Yeah.
Fire away at me, John.
I will. Yeah. I mean, we also, we get to the edge of mass sociogenic illness if we're going to try and understand the cultic phenomenon. And that this is like, you know, the Salem witch trials, as you well know, or the Devils of Loudun, which became the incredibly strange Ken Russell film, The Devils. And this is the idea that a group of people can be possessed by a set of ideas. This is pushed forward a little bit. So Bandy Lee, for example, and my friend Stephen Moffick are looking at what they call social psychiatry, which is the idea of a group developing a set of symptoms. I must say that I stand with trepidation on the brink of this idea, but you know, the idea that psychosis can belong to a group, a sociogenic illness, the idea that we adopt behaviors that belong in our group, which could go, you know, from genuflecting through to ritual murder in the case of, say, the Manson family, where you have an ethos, a creed that belongs to a group. And a lot of what we're talking about is how we should define these behaviors. And I think there's been a problem with social science that they don't want to believe that these behaviors exist, or They want to get rid of any words we can use to label it. So you have this peculiar idea, which I'm sure you've encountered once or twice, that the belief is that we think that there are brainwashed zombies. There are people, who are completely put under the control. And what a cult group is where you have hundreds or thousands or even millions of people who are utterly compliant. And
well, they're under a spell.
They're under a spell. I do.
I like that.
I do as well. I've come back to that year in, year out, that what used to be called enchantment is now called hypnosis. And so there's a recognition that people can fall for ideas and they can then follow them on. And generating those ideas are these people. And when we look at, I don't know, Prabhupada, Rajneesh, Osho, Rajneesh, Sun Myung Moon, Ron Hubbard, Ayn Rand, and there are hundreds and hundreds of these people through history. Mary Baker Eddy, Madame Blavatsky, Gurdjieff, on and on and on, this list of people. When we look at them, I think that what you're saying is an important, very important idea, because these people don't seem to have proper self-criticism. They don't seem to be able to understand their own behavior. And whenever they go wrong, they blame someone else, which is a characteristic, of course, of the sociopath generally, and malignant narcissists, psychopaths, whatever we want to call them, of predators, that the ability to apologize, the ability to accept responsibility seems to have gone away. And they therefore, because it's the fault of others, generate this godlike sense. I'm going to tell a little story. When I first met Jerry Armstrong in 1984, in June 1984, he told me about a little scale that he'd found written in Hubbard's private papers.
Let the people know who Jerry Armstrong is, because I know. Yes.
Yeah. Jerry was worked with Ron Hubbard in Scientology. He was a member of the Sea Organization. He ran intelligence, to tell cover stories for the Scientology ships in the Mediterranean, and very loyal follower of Ron Hubbard, a very intelligent man. And he, while they were kind of clearing up to make it look as if Ron Hubbard didn't run Scientology, so they were destroying swathes of documents because it was thought the FBI were going to come and do a second raid on Scientology. The largest raid in the history of the FBI in July 1977 was on Scientology. And it was thought in the late 70s, 1979, 80, that this was going to happen again. So they were shredding masses of documents that showed Hubbard's direct control of everything in Scientology. And a woman came to Jerry Armstrong and said, I've found 22 boxes of material about Ron Hubbard. Should we shred them? And Jerry went and looked at this material, and to his amazement found these 22 boxes, I'm presuming they were kind of banker's box size, had been traveling around the world since the foundation of Dianetics in 1950. Wherever Hubbard went, this huge, collection of boxes would go. In them were things such as his baby boots, letterhead that he'd stolen from many places, including the US Navy, that he would use for, and various Navy forms that he would fill in for his own benefit. There is, for example, a separation order for Ron Hubbard that shows that he has 21 medals, including a couple of Purple Hearts along the way. And it's a fake. It's a forgery. It actually has inconsistencies in it. In fact, the Purple Hearts are awarded with in the wrong form. Hubbard had actually got hold of.
Certainly, the government doesn't back him.
No, he received 4 standard medals, which are for, or 3 for being in a particular area of combat. He never actually saw combat.
And just to finish, Jerry, he was one of the first to really take on the brunt of Scientology's rebuttal, against it, right?
It's kind of interesting because it really you know, it really does go back to 1951 when Dr. Joseph Winter produced a doctor's report on Dianetics, having worked closely with Hubbard. And that's the beginning of it. By the time I wrote in 1990, there had been 14 books in English about Scientology, one way or another. I think the most important character was probably a man called James Phelan, who in 1963 exposed Hubbard's lies about his educational background, showing that Hubbard was not, in fact, a nuclear physicist, as he frequently claimed. He was not a civil engineer and he was not a mathematician. He was thrown out of George Washington University for deficiency in scholarship. He was put on probation and never returned. And then there was Michael Lynn Shannon, who's, you know, I didn't have access to Jerry's documents when I wrote Piece of Blue Sky. But I did have Shannon's documents, and he'd spent years collecting material. But Jerry, you know, he went to Hubbard and went, oh, can I collect material, biographical material, into an archive? Hubbard said yes. Now, normally within 2 weeks, he would have rescinded that order because that's the way Hubbard worked. But he went into hiding, and Jerry got 2 years to collect material and collected a huge amount of material about Ron Hubbard's life, which is called the L. Ron Hubbard Archive. I've been told that by the time Jerry left, there were 600,000 items in that archive. And there are some fascinating things in among there, like Hubbard in August 1938, a typed letter to his first wife, called the Skipper Letter, Dear Skipper, it reads, where he says, my only goal is to smash my name into history so hard that even if all the books are destroyed, I'll be remembered, or words fairly close to that, which is not quite what he told his followers. So anyway, Jerry told me that there was a black magic ceremony called the Blood Ritual, which Hubbard's biographer Omar Garrison showed to me at one point, a handwritten ceremony where Hubbard made a pact in the 1940s with Hathor, the Egyptian goddess, using his own blood, so that he would live under her dominion and command. She's also known as the Scarlet Woman, the Whore of Babylon, or the Empress. There are various, Kali, Diana, Artemis, wherever you go, you'll find.
He was trying to out Crowley at the time.
Very much so. He believed, and of course at the end of his life, in a document that was only seen by a very small number of top-level Scientologists, people who'd got through to the highest level, OT8, for a week. 2 years after Hubbard died in 1988, these people were treated to a document where Hubbard claimed that he was the Antichrist, that he was Lucifer. He had come to destroy Christianity. After a week, this document was withdrawn, but it was too late. It had already escaped. And you know, I'd seen it. I'd actually seen it before then, but we won't get into that.
Well, you know, yawn. How many people have claimed that before Hubbard?
Yeah,
so,
exactly.
Well, you know, what's the big deal? Antichrist. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so let's move on with Jerry.
The specific document that I'm referring to is a scale that Hubbard had left saying, and I will misremember it, and Jerry's probably not watching this, so we're probably all right. But as far as I recollect, it's something to the extent of animals, laborers, farmers, and it then goes up to fanatics and zealots. And above fanatics and zealots, you have the fool, and above the fool, you have God. And what Hubbard, in a lecture in 1952, December 52, talks about the fool card in the tarot and how important this is. And he's pretty evidently referring to the Book of Thoth by Aleister Crowley. He makes 3 references in those lectures to Crowley, calls him his good friend, which was not in fact true. And in the Book of Thoth, we have as you know, we have a pretty full description of the meaning of each tarot card. Hubbard focuses in, we identify it with Crowley because he says the fool has an alligator snapping at his heels. Most tarot packs have a dog, not an alligator on them. Crowley's has an alligator. And in this, in his lecture, he's saying that the fool is the transcendent state. This is the point where nothing can touch you. All energy goes through you. You have achieved, this wonderful state. And it becomes apparent when we think back that he'd written this little scale that he considered himself to have achieved this position of the fool, because what was underneath him, what he was trying to create, were fanatics and zealots. And so that self-conceit, that's where this long journey has gone to, this long meander has gone to, that self-conceit that Hubbard had, which again came out in various places. He was the Antichrist, he was Lucifer, he was the source. And that term started out as the source of Scientology, and he wasn't that. He stole it from all sorts of places. I wrote a paper called Possible Origins of Dianetics and Scientology, which is available on this channel, showing the many, many things that he took from Aleister Crowley and others, and then claimed were his. And he then elevates himself to this position, which is originally the source of Scientology, but he then comes to believe he's the demiurge. He is the creator of the universe. He is God. I wrote a little, when A Piece of Blue Sky, Let's Sell These People a Piece of Blue Sky, was first published in 1990, I made the statement that I believed that his intention was to be deified, like the Romans and like the Chinese, where an ancestor by their name being repeated continues to exist.
Right.
My only goal is to smash my name into history. 1938, Ron Hubbard. And that self-conceit, which seems to dwell with almost as a bipolar condition, that these people are excessively full of themselves. Somebody like, say, Maharaji, who believes he is God, or Osho the Buddha, who called himself Bhagwan, or the Supreme One. They seem to have this conceit. And as you say, they continue to screw up. They prophesy, they predict, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the world's going to end in 1914, 1919, 1930, on and on and on. I think 2033 is their next date for extinction. And somehow, because cognitive dissonance is what it is, they believe more firmly when they're proven wrong than they did, at the outset. So I think that imperviousness where, they'll have occasional collapses where they, as Hubbard very certainly did, where they tell people around them they are an imposter. So there's an interesting thing about Hubbard that, I have record of an interview from somebody who was with him in 1950, somebody who was with him in 1973, and from Serge Fouth, who was with him at the end of his life. And all three occasions, he's telling these people, I've achieved nothing. I've done nothing. This is all fake. But most of the time, he returns to that idea. And I think essential to Hubbard is nobody else was capable of discovering the technology. Nobody else could add anything significant. Nobody had ever done anything significant. And his claims became more and more grandiose. In a book called Fundamentals of Thought, he claims to have given the only ideas of value in 50,000 years of thinking men.
Yeah, interesting.
But, so you have this sense that the cult leader syndrome, maybe that opens it out a bit further. There might well have some doubt, but it's very private. They will then sell, their certainty, which of course is entirely fabricated and usually backed up by deception.
Let me funnel this back into the discussion whether or not we're just medicalizing deviants.
Yes.
For the sake of our own bias, as a sociologist of religion might say. So we brought up the word spell, which is a common word. In fact, one of the translations of mantra is to cast a spell in India. You use a god, you invoke a god, and you invoke him to do certain favors through a sacrifice or whatever, and you do a mantra to the god, and the god will somehow return that favor, much like the universe brings it to you or whatever. So you're casting a spell in order, and of course, Wicca and the old witch thing have done this for aeons, in the neo-pagan worldview. So we have that they have this power to cast a spell. Now, is that delusional? If that's delusional, then we're involved in something called, and if they get somebody else to believe in it, that they can really cast spells, we're in an area of folie à deux, shared delusion, which is a legitimate diagnosis of medicalizing someone with that. And I mean, I've had people under folie à deux in the psych hospital where I worked often. They would come in an adult daughter would believe in their mother's schizophrenic craziness about the government or whatever, and where the daughter wasn't schizophrenic at all, but she just came in, and once she was separated from the influence of the mother, much like when cult members are separated from the influence of the leader, sometimes they start thinking again, and the spell starts to leave them, and they're no longer under this metaphysical or psychological control. So that's medicalizing it one way. Is it a sickness? Is it an identification sickness? When you look at somebody like Hubbard, who, as you said, could not leave this because that was his only real identity. He had nothing besides that. He was a zero. He had erased himself. And therefore, for him to legitimately and completely deny his role as this genius, as this savior of mankind, would mean that he would have to erase his own identity, which human beings are very uncomfortable with, having no identity. We get anxious when somebody even mispronounces our name. We get anxious when they misquote our papers that we've written. When in other words, when they erase our identity, who we think we are. And then on the other side, we can feel blessed, by someone telling us, because they're psychic, that, I think you used to be a soldier with Julius Caesar back 2,000 years ago, and you were one of his top people. And so you say, tell me more. I want to hear about this. It massages the identification, So identification become a syndrome too if it's a fake ID. You begin to believe in it, kind of like the imposter syndrome. Now, you have some genius people that are wonderful thinkers, like, let's say, Aristotle. Everybody agrees with that, I think, in his day. He made some mistakes, obviously. He thought the brain was a cooling mechanism. He didn't understand it as a neurological, backdrop to the entire human thinking process. But he also gave us an enormous amount, a big boost towards sciences.
Oh, yeah.
When he broke with Plato. So maybe he had some self-doubt. Maybe he thought, being a reasonable man, could see his limitations, and didn't see himself as a great man as other people saw him, and certainly his legacy. So that would be the opposite of what we're talking about, as someone who is not accepting that incredible identity that they have
can go
in history.
two generations before Aristotle, Plato's teacher Socrates,
Right.
who explains that when the Sibyl had said that he was the wisest man in the world, he went finding wise people because he thought this was a ridiculous idea.
Exactly.
So he didn't
that's exactly what I'm
that.
talking about.
Yeah.
That's where reason and humility enter into the conversation. Reason and humility do not exist in the sick man's mind who has an utter investment in their narcissistic identification. So can we medicalize it? Can we call it a sickness? Can we, that's the question. And of course, it's up for debate, which is what we're doing here to some extent. And I'm sure some astute sociologists would have an argument. I'd like to hear it. But meanwhile, I'm going to push on with this paper and see if I can get it published. I have nothing to lose. I don't have a PhD. No one's going to take it away from me for coming up with some bullshit idea, so I can go and develop this as much as I want.
It's interesting when we come to the point that having a PhD could be seen as a handicap because you've got an identity.
And I think some people see it because they don't want to be hung out to dry by their peers. Well, I have no peers. I'm an artist. So.
Yeah, I think we're in very much the same situation. I co-wrote a paper for I think it was for the Oxford University Press. There you go. Who actually published James Lewis's book? So we've got no respect for them anyway. But they asked me how I should style myself, and it was suggested that I should call myself a practitioner scholar because I have no qualifications of any kind.
Okay.
Beyond
well, that sounds good. Practitioner scholar or amateur scholar or a populist scholar. I don't know what word you would use, because you obviously a scholar.
Well, I think practitioner is good because,
Yeah.
I mean, let's not get too literal, but as D.H. Lawrence said, those who can do and those who can't teach. And unfortunately, a lot of the academics we're dealing with have never really come to grips with what happens to somebody when their life is devastated and ruined by their involvement with the group. They seem, I mean, I've often said it's like, they'd walk through Auschwitz and comment on how nice the pajamas were.
Right.
That they're not focused on human hurt. And some of them are, it's a liberal idea that these groups should be allowed to believe what they want to believe. But of course, you and I think that groups should be allowed to believe what they want to believe. It's what they do that's a problem.
Right.
And if a group, starves people or so our friend Arthur Bookman in Scandinavia, who spent 12 years without seeing another human being at the direction of his cult leader. And they didn't have a little cave in the Himalaya. So they locked him in a room, I think in an apartment or a house, and he did not have human contact for 12 years. Now, a sociologist might look at that and go, well, that was a matter of his free will. But a psychologist might look at it and say, what do you mean by free will?
Yeah. Let me bring out something here in favor of the sociological position here about deviance, medicalizing it. Let's take, for instance, you have a really deranged cult leader who has schizophrenia and gets people to kill people. Charlie Manson, similar to that. For instance, completely gone. Because you medicalize deviance, you put him under a category of some kind of thing. Can he get off with an insanity defense? So now are we protecting them by medicalizing them? That's another question I have. Because they could end up in court and say, well, this guy, Szimhart, blah, 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 says I have a medical condition and I'm not responsible for what I'm doing. So, let's look at it that way. Are we letting them off the hook by creating a syndrome out of their behavior, which says they're kind of ill and they're not responsible for all this?
Which throws us into the whole question of actus reus and mens rea.
Yeah.
Did they commit the act, and did they intend to commit the act? Are they responsible for what happened? And this has become, it's been contentious for the last 20 years since the first work started coming through saying that criminal psychopaths, as tested by Kent Keel, Robert Hare's student initially, that Keel, I think, has now tested more than 500 criminal psychopaths using high-resolution fMRI,
right,
magnetic resonance imaging, and
it's in full color,
technicolor. And he has found that these people have a deficiency in the connection between the old brain, the limbus or ring, I think what the word means, donut pretty much, the old brain and the prefrontal cortex. And there is this, I have come to believe, simplistic idea about the old brain and the new brain connection. But on average, so I've read, the psychopath has 7% less material in the connection between the kind of impulsive part of the brain, the old brain, the reptilian brain, and the new thinking, clever part of the brain. And it was put forward in court a couple of decades ago for the first time that if you have this condition, you're born this way. There are 3 genetic alleles that can be traced to psychopathy. So you couldn't help it. And at that point, our construction of law falls apart.
Except they've been using this way of approaching psychopathic criminals, and if they can show while they're in prison that they have this condition and therefore they're more dangerous if we release them because they're not going to change, we'll keep them in prison. So it works to keep them in as well, and depends on the prison system. But yeah, it's fascinating because we're in a real juncture with neuroscience and how to how to diagnose or identify what the human function is. Is it delusional? Is it acting in reality? Is it something in between? Is it, is it being influenced from the outside, like a folia do? And how do you measure that? I mean, these measuring tools are important because then they're, quote, scientific and reliable, and repeatable.
And there is,
but we're kind of in the midst of this research right now, which is
we are, and all sorts of overconfident claims are still being made. I mean, I'm a big fan of the neurologist Robert A. Burton, who wrote a lovely book called On Being Certain, but he also wrote A Skeptic's Guide to the Brain. And I think it's Skeptic's Guide to the Brain. I've got a copy of it. No, Skeptic's Guide to the Mind, correction. And he says...
There's a difference.
Yeah, there certainly is for me. He was head of neurology at Mount Zion Hospital and a professor at the University of California in San Francisco. So he has some background in the subject. And he basically says, be very careful when you start believing what neurologists profess. And certainly in my reading of Damasio, Ramachandran, Oliver Sacks, and a number of others, there are overconfident claims being made. One of them, which I first read in 1984 and have read pretty much every year since, is in the last 10 years, we've made more progress in neurology than the whole history of neurology up to this point. And that one just keeps trotting out for 40 years now. I think we need to bring reason to bear, and I think we need bring skepticism to bear and be very careful what we're doing. The Yorkshire Ripper, as he's called in this country, Peter Sutcliffe, a man who attacked women with a hammer and beat them to death, was originally a judge basically found, yes, he was crazy, but made a strange order, which seems to violate law, which said, but he should be kept locked up for life, no matter what. And about 4 years ago, he was actually declared sane and moved from Broadmoor Psychiatric Hospital into a prison. And you have this. So how do we know and how do we tell? And are we going to say, well, this person has a larger part of the brain here?
Yeah.
Are we now going back to, the 19th century idea that if somebody's eyes are too close together, they're a liar, which has stayed in the language, but there used to be police charts that we used to say, if you're a big nose, you're a pickpocket. If you've got, all sorts of these. Are we now going to do this with brain regions? Are we going to go into somewhere there? So I think we have to be careful. We have to look at behaviors. The folie à deux, the madness of two. There's also the folie à plusieurs, the madness of many, where a whole group, and that brings us into mass sociogenic illness. And if you have a leader who has a delusive self-reference that they think, as Charles Manson did, let's come back to him. He thought he was Manson, son of man.
Yes.
Jesus Christ, second coming.
My God, these New Ages are literal.
And the truth is that his father wasn't actually called Manson. That was the man that his mother married to give him a name. I think he was called No Name Maddox when he was born, and he should have stuck with it. But that once that delusion enters in, then we might also be talking about another condition, which is a definite and recognized disorder, and that's temporal lobe epilepsy.
Yeah.
That it's Yuval Laor, the great scholar Yuval Laor, came to me in 2015, a seminar I was giving, getting clear from Scientology in Toronto. It's the first time we met, and he said, do you think Ron Hubbard was a temporal lobe epileptic? And I said, I haven't given it much thought. And I remember when it sort of came out in the late 70s and St. Paul and Muhammad and all sorts of people were tarred with this thing. And he put down the 18 characteristics of the Bear Fidio index inventory. And it was amazing. I sat there as somebody who spent far too much time studying the life of Ron Hubbard, and I ticked 17 out of 18 straight away.
Interesting. Just to let you know, my old cult leader, Elizabeth Clare Prophet, was diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy and did have seizures throughout her life, was not permitted to drive a car ever, even when she was guru. You know, so all of this stuff about healing from ascended masters, she was the connection to all of the great healers in the heavens, never could heal her epilepsy.
That's a fascinating revelation, because Yuval has continued to look at other leaders and that sense of certainty they project, the intense religious experience, hypergraphia, the inability to stop writing. Ron Hubbard is listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as the most prolific author of all time.
You know, just on that line, I had a client whose daughter was in some cult, and this middle-aged woman told me about her life, and she had this form of epilepsy, and when the aura would come on her prior to that, because she didn't always have a seizure with it, she said she could have written 5 novels. Her imagination was just flying when that pre-seizure aura came upon her. You know, and she did a lot of creative stuff, but it wasn't organized very well. But apparently, for some reason, for some people, that disease induces a kind of weird creativity.
Yeah, wasn't organized very well.
That's not in the end, no.
That's the statement about Hubbard too. There are 28 books in Scientology outside of the collections of various things. Of those 28 books, 27 were written by other people. Dianetics and Modern Science of Mental Health, or Mental Science of Modern Health, as I like to think of it, was written by Hubbard. He claimed 4 years after writing it to a woman called Joe Scott in London that it was the product of automatic writing dictated to him by the Empress, Kali, who we've already encountered in this episode. His tutelary divinity, as they say, or genius, to use the old-fashioned word for it. But the other 27 books, you know, Science of Survival, his second book, was compiled from this disorganized scramble of recordings and writings that he'd made. He'd recorded things on little green discs. Was put together by Richard DeMille, whose father, Cecil B. DeMille, was even more famous than Ron Hubbard, Ben-Hur. And he went on to become a psychology professor after he'd abandoned Hubbard, but he wrote 3 of Hubbard's books. Then there was Althea Hart. He wrote Scientology 8.80, and every book from 54 to 78 was written and from Hubbard's notes, but that inability to organize the material, which is such an aspect of Scientology that nothing is ever canceled, nothing goes away, even when it completely
Interestingly, just to bring this up, Blavatsky was a prolific writer. She would stay up for days and just pages would fly off her desk. They were very poorly organized. Olcott and others had to edit them, put the punctuation in, arrange them, because Blavatsky had no mind for that kind of organization, you know, but she was prolific in that sense. And she could, you know, speak different languages, you know, because she was European, obviously, and had to learn these as she traveled. But as far as organization, no, you know, which I find interesting.
And we're sort of homing in on something that might well be a syndrome.
Oh, let me bring up one more point. The big one, A Course in Miracles. It was published, it was written over a course of 7 years, where this woman, Helen Schuckman, was hearing this voice, which she claimed was Jesus, you know, dictating this stuff to her and would not let her alone until she was finished every night. She couldn't even sleep. She had to write this stuff out for 7 years, and then it was done. And then it became this pile of manuscripts that her and Bill Thetford, her boss at the hospital, decided what to do with, because he would listen to her recite this stuff every day, and he would help write it down. But what she had written down had no punctuation, no paragraphs. It was just run-on sentences. And they got this editor who was a Jewish fellow that was a former Catholic seminarian, put that together, and he decided to edit it, and he made sense of it. You know, so in a way, he shaped it into what we have today. It didn't come out of the mouth of God, so to speak, originally in that situation. You can say the same about a lot of sacred scriptures, perhaps in the Quran to some extent.
Well,
because it was recited, it wasn't written. You know, there was a scribe that knew how to write that wrote it down. You know, that would punctuate and do all of that kind of thing. So the original inspiration is kind of a mess. You have to find, you know, and you find this with people that are channelers that channel information. You know, it just pours out and flows. It's not really well organized information. You know, unless they planned it ahead of time, which some do. You know, they plan like a lecture, they rehearse it, and then they claim that, you know, the great God Ra is channeling it through me, and it sounds like you know, a dissertation from a college student. You know, his first few pages or something, which means it's been prepared. But anyway, I just wanted to bring that up, that maybe have something to do with this malfunction or dysfunction in the temporal lobe.
Yeah, we should probably round up 100 cult leaders and give them brain scans and see what we can find out.
We missed out on it. So many of them are dead.
Oh, there are plenty more popping up.
Okay, well, we'll try again.
Yeah, and maybe if we get them young, you know, and can do a longitudinal
when they're
study.
naive enough and narcissistic enough to want to prove to the world that they really have a brain
Special
that
brain.
is working, you know, in sync with God. Yeah, that would be good. Yeah,
that would be the thing to do. But yeah, I think, I mean, I've been in the last few years coming towards the same idea that there seem to be certain types of personality who, you know, Eric Fromm's definition of the narcissist, I think, is very good, the malignant narcissist. That contrary to Freud's thinking, a narcissist is not a person who loves himself, a person who don't know how to love. And they need adulation from others to have any sense of self or standing in the world.
Right. It's a matter of wanting others to love a version of themselves that they're inventing.
Yes. Yes.
And that continue to feed back on that outside version of themselves, and don't look behind the curtain. Don't look at that little guy doing the
standing on the stool with a megaphone behind the curtain.
Right. Yeah, just keep your eye on the wizard. You know, don't look at that little insecure guy that's behind the curtain. I mean, that's kind of like the Hollywood version of the narcissist, the Great Wizard of Oz, but a benign narcissist, if you want.
Hard to tell, really, with the Wizard of Oz. And I think Frank Baum's original novels are quite remarkable.
They're quite richer in
yeah.
You know, I've read them, and nothing like the Hollywood version.
No.
You know, there's a lot of differences, a lot more nuances about the aspects of the human psyche, which you can find in there, and kind of a modern mythology, if you will, which is very rich. You know, yeah.
Absolutely, it shows an author who is trying to explain a perception of the world and people through a great story. You know, say as you know, in Gulliver's Travels, we find out about a great deal about politics in the 18th century if we look closely, and about human nature throughout the ages. But so I think there is something to be said. And on the other hand, you know, you have the type of people who are attracted to such groups. And I would say that's probably 98% of the population. The 2% I'm going to exclude are psychopaths, because even when I did in Scientology, most certainly meet some psychopaths who had found, I remember one guy, he came up to me on the street, and he was a very high level Scientologist who I'd known years before. And he came up to me and smiled at me and said that he'd stayed in Scientology because Scientologists were so much easier to prey on than other people.
Interesting.
And, you know, so, but apart from, you know, and you certainly got narcissistic salespeople. They were a commonplace, people who would sell you stuff. And then when you said it's got a lifetime guarantee, they say, well, that wasn't your lifetime or its lifetime. It's the lifetime of somebody who's dead. And your guarantee is worth nothing, you know.
Wow.
So, and Ariel Moreri in studying suicide bombers and his and Anne Speckhart and Captain Akhmedova's work, there may be more recent work I don't know about, but they're the only people I know of who actually studied terrorists. There are a lot of people who've talked about it, but Murari studied hundreds of failed bombers, relatives of bombers, over a period of decades, and did come to the conclusion that you'd find more people who suffered from the dependent personality disorder among the actual suicide bombers, not among the people who recruited them or the so-called engineers who made the bombs. But there was, there were slightly more. Generally, in my experience of people who've been in so-called cults, what I would call destructive cults or authoritarian cults, you find every type of person. But among the leaders, there seemed to be a set of criteria, one of which is thinking you're all that, thinking you are, as Maharaji and Rajneesh said, that you are God. You are the incarnation.
You know, what's interesting when you talk about the leaders, they very rarely, I mean, it's happened a few times here and there, maybe incidentally, where the cult leaders have conventions among themselves and, discuss reality and all that. That rarely happens because the narcissistic load almost prevents it. Everyone is a fake and I'm the only true one is what's driving that. What's interesting, I remember in Santa Fe, when I lived there, there was at the main hotel in downtown, the La Fonda, there was a convention of astrologers. This is back in the late 70s and early 80s, I think. And I was doing portraits right on the plaza, and I would go into La Fonda sometimes to get coffee. They had a great coffee shop. And I sat with a few of the astrologers because they were on break, from their talks, and there was a couple hundred or more there. And one of them told me, this one young guy, he said, if you want to be around people who never agree with one another, he says, come to one of these conventions, because it's such a subjective art that, Pisces to one astrologer with opposite the moon and with the Saturn return and all this means one thing, and they influence their client to see it a certain way. And it'll mean something else to another astrologer who maybe favors Jungian interpretation of astrology, and so it's so nuanced, it's so subjective that they have a hard time agreeing on anything, but they all get along, they're friendly and, all of that good stuff. So
one man's fish is another man's poisson, if you'll excuse me.
There you
go. And again, with academics, and of course, also with, in Scientology, you have this idea that all of the psychiatrists, psychotherapists, and psychologists are in a conspiracy to destroy all life in the universe. And you're going, well, for me, two psychiatrists or two psychologists talking is like two rabbis talking. There'll be three different opinions, It's just all there is to it.
No, I've worked with a lot of psychiatrists, and, of course, in general, when you're working in a crisis hospital, there's a pretty good agreement about which medications to apply to which patient. They're good at this, because they know the results and they know, doing some labs or whatever on the patient, and they can adjust them as time goes on. But there can be major conflicts based on the diagnosis. One person will say bipolar, another one will say schizophrenia, another one will say psychotic disorder, NOS, not otherwise specified, which means almost anything goes. And give them Haldol, which is like a universal drug for psychosis. and it works temporarily. But there is some organized sanity in that field. It's not as crazy as people think it is, because I've been in the midst of it. But there is deviance from one psychiatrist to another, and some of them I worked with were quite nutty in their own beliefs, their personal beliefs. Like one psychiatrist, a lady I knew, that would bring her little dog in with her to work. It was, for some reason she was allowed to. She was going to see Sylvia Browne and paying lots of money to get psychic readings. And I said, are you kidding me? And I blurted that out. And she goes, well, what do you mean? Don't you like Sylvia Browne? And I said, well, so I backed up and I explained to her that some of Sylvia Browne's predictions were so blatantly off, that she had made, that she stopped doing political predictions after a while. And And I said, well, how did your readings go with her? And she goes, thinking back, they weren't all that great. And yet this MD, medical doctor that's treating people's psychiatric disorders, believes in that stuff, so you got to let it go to some extent. But at the same time, I had a little bit of an effect on her by just bringing up a little skeptical remark about the predictive value of this woman's abilities.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, we have this thing here that we see in TV shows about how psychics have helped the police. And so a friend of mine wrote to all 41 police forces in United Kingdom and said, how often has a psychic helped you? And half of them didn't reply, and the other half said, never. So,
yeah, exactly. That's been the conclusion in most states in the U.S.
Yeah,
they won't allow it, and a lot of states won't allow lie detectors, for instance, because of the pseudoscience behind lie detection. It works to some degree, but it's not a foolproof technique for determining.
The guy who initiated the use of polygraphs, there's a great book called Tremors in the Blood about the history of it, said that the polygraph is fundamentally a psychological form of third degree being beating somebody until they answer. It's a way of scaring people into confessing. In and of itself, it is a completely worthless instrument. It measures anxiety.
I think some people come into it thinking they're looking at an instrument that's the eye of God, or they're being seen, and they have to tell the truth. The instrument itself creates that in some people, and other people that are psychopathic look at that instrument and they lie through their teeth and they get away with it.
Yeah,
because there's no reaction. The machine's not picking up a reaction.
Yeah, it's a form of what Robert J. Lifton would call sacred science. It's not actually a scientific instrument.
John, I've got to go here in about 3 minutes to go see my mom and a social worker. So
Good.
Any last words? I have no idea how my paper is going to come out, but I thank you very much for allowing us to discuss it and to see if cult leader syndrome is a thing.
It's a fascinating idea. Thank you for bringing it to us. And once you've produced your paper, your article, then let's talk about it again.
Wonderful. Yeah. I'll run it by you. I'll email you a copy for you to Redmark.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Great.
I got to go. Have a good day, my friend.
Yeah, you too. Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.